On April 25, 2026, Ukrainian drones reached the Ural Mountain cities more than 1,800 kilometers from Ukraine's border that no military planner in Moscow had ever seriously considered defending against Ukrainian attack. That single fact tells you everything about how much this war has shifted in 4 years. And it is only one part of a broader campaign that in a single week in April 2026 struck refineries, ports, petrochemical plants, oil depots, pipeline pumping stations, and drilling platforms across 6 Russian regions, and reduced Russia's oil export capacity by approximately 40% at the precise moment the Kremlin was counting on surging global energy prices to fund another year of war. This is the story of how Ukraine built a long-range precision strike program from scratch, how it deployed that program against the economic foundation of Russia's war machine, and why the Kremlin, unable to stop it militarily, has resorted to threatening European nations whose technical support makes it possible. Start with what happened on the ground in Tuapse, a Russian city on the Black Sea coast in Krasnodar Krai. On April 16, 2026, Ukrainian drones struck the Rosneft refinery and port export terminal there. More than 150 firefighters and emergency personnel spent days fighting the blaze before it was brought under control. 4 days later, on April 20th, before the damage from the first strike had even been fully assessed, Ukrainian drones hit the same facility again. Fire broke out again in the storage tank area. The refinery suspended operations entirely. By April 22nd, residents of Tuapse were reporting something that the independent Russian telegram channel Astra described as a man-made disaster. Oil products had spread across roads near the facility. Locals were collecting it in barrels. A sardonic post from another independent Russian outlet captured the moment precisely. "It's raining oil in Tuapse," it read. "We advise locals to put out barrels." Finally, an oil and gas country is sharing oil with its people instead of sponsoring a war with it. That dark humor from inside Russia reflects something important: the gap between what Russia's oil wealth is supposed to represent, national strength, geopolitical leverage, economic insulation, and what it has become in practice, a target. To understand why Ukraine chose this particular moment to intensify its energy infrastructure campaign, and why the timing is strategically significant rather than coincidental, you need to understand what was happening in global oil markets in early 2026. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in early March 2026, following the outbreak of the Iran war on February 28, global oil prices did something the Kremlin had been hoping for across years of sanctions and budget pressure. They surged. Brent crude climbed above $120 per barrel. At that price level, Russia's oil exports even discounted under the Urals benchmark, even rooted through the shadow fleet and alternative buyers that sanctions had forced Moscow to cultivate, would have generated a revenue windfall large enough to fund the war for another year. It could have helped replenish the National Wealth Fund, which had been drawn down from $185 billion to barely $35 billion. It could have given Putin the fiscal room to hold his position diplomatically and militarily for the foreseeable future. Ukraine looked at that windfall and went after it directly. On March 21st, Kyiv intensified its long-range strike campaign against Russian port and energy infrastructure with a clear strategic logic. If Russia cannot load oil onto tankers, it cannot export oil. If it cannot export oil, the price surge that should have been a gift to the Kremlin becomes financially irrelevant. And if the global oil market is already under supply pressure from the Hormuz closure, denying Russia its export capacity simultaneously tightens supply further and prevents the adversary from benefiting from the conditions that tightening creates. Ukraine was, in effect, weaponizing the Iran war against Russia. It was turning the Strait of Hormuz closure into an instrument of economic pressure on Moscow. The results were documented by Reuters, Al Jazeera, the Atlantic Council, Kyiv Post, and every serious energy market publication tracking the campaign. By late March, Ukrainian drone strikes on port infrastructure had temporarily reduced Russia's oil export capacity by approximately 40%. Reuters described it as the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. An estimated 2 million barrels per day of export capacity went offline. The Baltic ports of Ust-Luga and Primorsk, which together handle an enormous share of Russia's seaborne crude exports, were repeatedly struck and repeatedly forced to suspend operations. When an Aframax tanker docked at Ust-Luga on April 5, the first vessel to attempt loading there in many days, Ukraine struck the port again. The same night, setting 320,000 cubic meter storage tanks ablaze. The message required no interpretation. There is no return to normal operations while the campaign continues. Satellite imagery confirmed what industry sources were already reporting. Primorsk had lost 40% of its storage capacity. Ust-Luga had lost 30%. Novatek had suspended gas condensate processing and exports. Finnish maritime officials told Reuters in early April that weekly shipments from the 2 Baltic ports had fallen to individual vessels, down from a previous average of 250 ships per week. Leningrad Regional Governor Alexander Drozdenko, representing the region where Russia's most critical Baltic oil export infrastructure is located, told a regional assembly on April 15 that St. Petersburg had effectively become a frontline region. He announced plans to recruit reservists to form mobile fire teams stationed near industrial facilities with the specific mission of shooting down drones. Russia's second city was organizing a civilian air defense militia because its governor had concluded that Ukrainian drones would keep coming and that the Russian military's existing air defense capacity in that region was insufficient to stop them. On the Black Sea, the Tuapse refinery was struck twice in 4 days, as already noted. That facility processes 12 million tons of crude per year, producing naphtha, diesel, fuel oil, and vacuum gas oil, and it is directly integrated with the Black Sea Port Export Terminal. Both its refining and export functions were effectively halted by the combined strikes. Ukrainian drones also struck the Shesk oil terminal in Novorossiysk, the southern endpoint of Russia's main oil pipeline system, handling up to 1 million barrels per day, or approximately 20% of Russia's total seaborne oil exports on multiple occasions. Satellite imagery captured by the agency Venter showed an oil spill into the Black Sea at Tuapse following the April 17 strike. Ukraine struck further still into Russian territory. The Samara refinery, more than 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine's border, the Gorky refinery in Nizhny Novgorod, 500 kilometers from the border, 2 drilling platforms in the northern Caspian Sea, 2 oil pumping stations in the Volga and Krasnodar regions, an oil depot in the city of Tver northwest of Moscow, the Taliati as a ammonia plant in the Volga region, the Sterlitamak petrochemical plant in the Republic of Bashkortostan, all confirmed by geolocated video footage or by Russian officials, all struck within a single week in April, each adding its specific increment of damage to a cumulative campaign that independent oil analyst Boris Ehrenstein, speaking to the Current Time media outlet, described as the most serious threat to Russian oil exports since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Ehrenstein chose a particular word to describe what had changed: thoughtfulness. The thoughtfulness, the scale and direction of the attacks, as well as the timing of their execution, all this together produced an effect that he said he personally could not recall in 4+ years of war. That word is important because it identifies what is genuinely new about Ukraine's 2026 energy campaign. Earlier, Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure were frequently effective in isolation but limited in systemic impact because Russia could begin repairing one facility while Ukraine was hitting another. The campaign's damage was real but episodic. What changed in 2026 is not only range or payload, it is doctrine. Ukraine is now executing coordinated repeat strikes on the same high-value targets, timed specifically to interrupt repair efforts before export capacity can be restored. The April 20th strike on Tuapse came 4 days after the April 16th strike. On the same facility, the April 5th strike on Ust-Luga came on the same day the first post-attack tanker attempted to dock. Ukraine is monitoring Russian repair timelines and striking again before they complete. It is a siege logic applied to energy infrastructure, not one strike that disrupts, but a sustained sequence designed to prevent recovery. President Zelensky announced on April 17, speaking from Kyiv while Ukrainian forces were simultaneously striking targets across 6 Russian regions, that Ukraine's deep strikes had cost Russia no less than $2.3 billion in lost oil revenue in the month of March alone. He delivered that figure with what he described as deliberate understatement. Today, our deep strikes are no longer a sensation. They had stopped being a sensation not because they were unremarkable, but because they had become so frequent, so methodically expanded in range and target selection, and so consistently effective that the Kremlin had been forced to restructure its domestic security assumptions around a new reality that every major military and energy facility in Russia, including those previously considered safely beyond Ukrainian reach, must now be treated as a potential target. The fiscal context for all of this matters enormously. Sweden's military intelligence chief, Thomas Nilsson, told the Financial Times that Russia would need oil prices to remain above $100 per barrel for the rest of 2026 simply to cover its budget deficit. At the moment those prices finally arrived, driven by the Hormuz closure, Ukraine was ensuring Russia could not capture the revenue those prices were supposed to generate. The National Wealth Fund, at roughly $35 billion and falling, is approaching the level at which it can no longer absorb the kind of annual deficit that results from directing 40% of total federal expenditure toward defense and security while oil and gas revenues collapse in the first 2 months of 2026. Before the Iran war briefly pushed prices up, those revenues had already fallen 47% year-on-year. Russia's forced production cuts make the situation concrete. Reuters, citing 5 industry sources, calculated that Russia had been compelled to cut crude production by 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day as a direct result of Ukraine's strikes on export infrastructure. These are not wells that lack buyers. This is production being throttled because the ports and terminals that would load it onto tankers are burning, suspended, or too damaged to operate at capacity. Russian business newspaper Kommersant reported that exports had declined to their lowest levels since the summer of 2024, and that by the end of April they could fall to their lowest point since 2023. That is the economic reality behind what Putin had been counting on from the Iran crisis, the oil windfall that was supposed to fund the war, refill the reserve fund, and give Moscow the financial breathing room to outlast Western support for Ukraine has been systematically intercepted. The pipeline is producing, the wells are drilling. But the export terminals are burning and the tankers are waiting at empty berths. Then came April 25th. In the early hours of that morning, Ukrainian drones reached Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk cities more than 1,800 kilometers from Ukraine's border, deep in Russia's interior, east of the Ural Mountains, and far beyond any boundary that military analysts had previously identified as the practical limit of Ukraine's strike range. Smoke rose over Yekaterinburg in footage that spread across social media within minutes. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed that 127 Ukrainian drones had been intercepted across multiple regions overnight. The governors of both the Sverdlovsk and Chelyabinsk regions confirmed the attacks, which confirmed simultaneously that drones had reached those regions, that they had been engaged by local air defenses, and that some had gotten through. The target in Yekaterinburg was assessed by monitoring sources as the Vector Enterprise, a defense-linked manufacturer of radio and navigation equipment that is part of the Almazante concern, the same defense conglomerate that produces Russia's S-300 and S-400 air defense systems. Ukraine was striking the factory that makes guidance and navigation components for the very missile systems Russia uses to shoot down Ukrainian drones and missiles. The symmetry was deliberate. In Chelyabinsk, Russian telegram channels reported possible activity near the Chelyabinsk metallurgical plant and the Higher Military Aviation School of Navigators, a facility that trains Russian military pilots. Drone attack alerts were issued for the first time in neighboring Kurgan Oblast, extending the active threat zone to yet another Russian region that had never previously been touched by the war. Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu, Russia's former defense minister, now serving in a different senior role, effectively acknowledged in a statement that Ukrainian UAVs had extended their range to the point of reaching targets deep in Russian territory. That acknowledgement from one of Russia's most senior security officials was itself a measure of how dramatically the strategic environment had shifted since February 2022. The weapon enabling these deep strikes is Ukraine's domestically developed long-range strike drone, the Lyuty, with an estimated operational range of up to 2,000 kilometers depending on flight path and launch configuration. This is a weapon Ukraine built itself under wartime conditions to fill a capability gap that Western partners were unwilling or unable to fill through direct provision of equivalent systems. The Atlantic Council's analysis, published weeks before the Ural strikes, had already concluded that Ukraine's air offensive looked set to continue gaining momentum as new drone and missile capabilities came online. The Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk strikes were the confirmation that the momentum was not just continuing, it was accelerating. The Kremlin's response to the broader campaign revealed the extent of its strategic discomfort. Russia issued a formal warning to European nations over their support for Ukraine's drone program, specifically stating that the provision of components, financing, and technical assistance for Ukraine's long-range drone production constituted a deliberate step leading to a sharp escalation of the military and political situation across the entire European continent. The warning promised unpredictable consequences and accused European leaders of dragging their countries toward direct involvement in the war. These are the words of a government that has lost control of a strategic variable it did not anticipate and has no credible military solution for. Russia cannot stop Ukraine's drone campaign. Its air defense network has gaps that Ukraine has learned, through 4 years of operational experience, to identify and exploit. When Russian defenses intercept 127 drones in a single night and Ukrainian drones still reach Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk, the arithmetic is clear: the defense cannot be made comprehensive. The threat envelope is too wide, the launching vectors too varied, and the drones too inexpensive to be stopped in their entirety at any acceptable cost. So the Kremlin threatens Europe because threatening European governments is the only lever it retains on this specific problem. The architecture of Putin's current strategic position comes into focus when you map out what he is simultaneously betting on. He is betting that economic pressure on Ukraine-depleted reserves, manpower losses, infrastructure damage from 4 years of Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities will eventually force Kyiv or its Western partners to accept a ceasefire before Ukraine's deep strike campaign has fully destroyed Russia's capacity to export oil at the revenue scale the budget requires. He is betting that North Korean troop contributions and ammunition resupply through the Caspian corridor will keep Russian forces in the field long enough for that pressure to materialize in a diplomatic format. He is betting that the Trump administration's stated preference for deal-making over prolonged military engagement will translate into pressure on Ukraine to accept terms before Ukraine's military leverage has been fully applied. And he is betting that European unity, which has held with remarkable cohesion since 2022, will eventually crack under the combined weight of energy costs, economic anxiety, and the escalation fears that Russia's threats are precisely designed to amplify. Ukraine's deep strike campaign is the direct counter to each of those bets, not through diplomacy, and not through the kind of decisive territorial breakthrough that has proved extraordinarily difficult against Russia's fortified defensive lines in the east, but by attacking the economic infrastructure that makes sustaining the bets Financially possible. If Russia cannot export oil at the revenue level its budget requires, the timeline for how long any of those gambles can be maintained shortens regardless of what North Korean troops or Caspian ammunition deliveries contribute. The National Wealth Fund at $35 billion and shrinking is approaching the level at which it cannot absorb another year of deficits driven by 40% defense expenditure without forcing a choice the Kremlin has so far refused to make: reduce military spending or face a fiscal deterioration that no amount of threatening rhetoric toward European capitals can arrest. Zelensky stated publicly that he would stop targeting Russian oil export infrastructure only if Russia agreed to stop striking Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure. Russia has shown no indication of accepting that condition. The conditions under which the campaign would end are precisely the conditions Russia has consistently refused to create. So the strikes continue, the refineries burn, the port terminals suspend loading, the tankers wait, the revenue fails to arrive, and the arithmetic of the Russian war economy moves, month by month, in a direction that the Kremlin's own fiscal planners understand and cannot publicly acknowledge. One detail captures the cumulative effect of Ukraine's deep strike program on Russia's confidence in its own territorial security more vividly than any single statistic. During China's visit to Moscow for Russia's Victory Day parade in May 2025, Beijing reportedly asked Ukraine to refrain from striking Moscow during the visit because China was uncertain whether Russia could provide sufficient protection for its visiting leadership. China, Russia's most important strategic partner, did not trust Russia to protect its own capital from Ukrainian drones. That uncertainty, embedded in a diplomatic request from an ally rather than an adversary, encapsulates what 4 years of Ukrainian innovation in long-range strike capability have produced. A country that began the full-scale war with no meaningful strike reach beyond its own borders has built, domestically and under active bombardment, the tools to reach 1,800 kilometers into Russia's interior. It has struck the factories that produce Russian air defense components. It has struck the refineries that process Russian crude. It has struck the ports that load Russian oil onto tankers. It has struck the terminals, the depots, the pumping stations, the petrochemical plants, and it has done so with a consistency and a sequencing that has moved from improvisation to doctrine, from episodic disruption to sustained, repair-denying pressure on a system Russia depends on for the revenue that funds everything else. April 2026 did not represent the peak of that campaign. The Atlantic Council assessed it as gaining momentum. Ukraine's domestically produced drone fleet is expanding in range and scale. The Ural strikes were a new threshold, not a ceiling. And until the conditions Zelensky named are met, until Russia stops striking Ukrainian civilian energy infrastructure, Kyiv has indicated clearly that the campaign will continue. The drones keep flying east, the oil keeps failing to load, and in Tuapse, in a detail that required no editorial comment from anyone reporting it, residents were collecting oil from the roads in barrels. That image, the wealth that was supposed to power Russia's war instead pooling on the streets of a Russian city, is the clearest summary available of where Putin's gamble currently stands.